Story number 5. The Haunting Secret in Chloe's Closet. It was a chilly November evening in the small town of Willowsburg. The air was crisp, and the rustling of dry leaves outside filled the silence. Mike had just returned from his late shift at the auto repair shop, exhausted but happy to be home. His wife, Leah, had already gone to bed, and their 8-year-old daughter, Chloe, was presumably fast asleep in her room. Mike set his lunchbox down and tiptoed through the house, careful not to wake anyone. He pushed open Chloe's door to check on her, as he did every night. She lay under her rainbow-patterned blanket, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. A soft smile touched his lips. He turned to leave, but paused when he heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the closet. It was a rustling, like fabric brushing against something solid. His heart tightened. The town had been buzzing lately with stories of break-ins, and he couldn't shake the sense that something was very wrong. He closed Chloe's door softly behind him and hurried to the kitchen, where he grabbed the old baseball bat he kept in the pantry. He returned to Chloe's room, his pulse thundering in his ears. Steeling himself, he slowly approached the closet. The door was ajar, a small crack of darkness spilling out. Taking a deep breath, Mike gripped the bat tightly and swung the door open with a loud bang. He barely had time to react. 2 figures burst from the closet, clad in all black, with ski masks covering their faces. The intruders moved fast, but so did Mike. He swung the bat wildly, catching one of them in the shoulder. The other lunged at him, and they tumbled to the floor, locked in a desperate struggle. Chloe woke up, her terrified screams piercing through the chaos. "Leah, call the police," Mike roared, adrenaline surging through him as he managed to push one of the intruders off. Leah, jolted awake, scrambled to grab her phone and call for help. The second man tried to escape, but Mike swung the bat again, forcing him to stumble back. Just then, the wail of approaching sirens filled the air, and the intruders made a break for the window, vanishing into the night. Moments later, the police arrived, taking statements and searching the area. They found no trace of the men, except for muddy footprints leading away from the house. The officers reassured Mike and Leah they'd patrol the neighborhood, but the fear lingered, an oppressive weight that refused to lift. As the police were about to leave, one officer approached Mike. "We've seen a pattern with these break-ins," he said grimly. "They're not just stealing. They seem to be targeting families, watching them for days, figuring out their routines." A cold shiver ran down Mike's spine. These weren't just intruders looking for valuables. They were predators who had studied his family. Chloe's closet, her safe haven full of toys and dresses, had been invaded by darkness and danger. That night, as Mike held his daughter close, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed deeper, the house quieter. Every creak and groan of the old wooden floors kept him on edge, haunted by the thought that those men had planned something far more sinister than a simple robbery. From that day on, he never took their safety for granted, reinforcing locks and installing cameras. Yet, no matter how secure their house became, the memory of that night lingered, an unsettling reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come from the places we least expect. Story number 6. The Night We Brought the Haunt Home. It was a crisp autumn night in the city of Crestfall, known for its historic buildings and the annual Fear Manor haunted house event that drew thrill seekers from miles around. Jason, Leah, Mateo, and Annika, four friends with a taste for the supernatural, had eagerly anticipated this night. Fear Manor was infamous, rumored to be one of the most terrifying haunted attractions in the region, and the group couldn't wait to test their courage. Laughter echoed as they entered the sprawling Victorian mansion turned haunted house. Dim lighting, eerie fog, and unsettling whispers made their hair stand on end. Annika, always the skeptic, scoffed at the jump scares, but Jason and Mateo weren't too proud to admit they'd flinched more than once. Leah clung to her boyfriend, Jason, nervously eyeing each creaking door and shadowy corner. Come on, you guys, Annika teased as they reached the final room, an elaborately staged Victorian parlor filled with dusty antiques and a ghastly mannequin dressed as a masked undertaker. It's all fake. Just as she said that, the mannequin sprang to life, letting out a guttural roar. The friends screamed, stumbling backward in a mix of terror and laughter. But as they left the haunted house, another figure, a tall man with a black mask, pale clothing, and a wide brimmed hat, seemed to melt out of the shadows behind them. Clever addition, Mateo said, snapping a photo with his phone. The man didn't respond, only standing perfectly still, his eyes hidden behind the mask's dark lenses. Shaking off the unease, the group made their way to Jason's car, parked under a flickering streetlight. They drove off, joking about their experience and debating which part had been the scariest. It wasn't until they reached Leah's house that things took a darker turn. As Leah stepped out of the car, her voice wavered. Hey, Jason, did anyone else see that? She asked, pointing toward the far end of the quiet cul-de-sac. There, bathed in the amber glow of the street lamp, was the same masked man from Fear Manor, standing unnaturally still. Jason forced a laugh. It's probably one of the actors trying to freak us out, he reasoned. But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and the fear bubbling up inside him felt real. The group hurried into Leah's house, locking the doors and closing the blinds. They gathered in the living room, attempting to shake off the encounter. Annika checked her phone, browsing the photos they had taken earlier. Her hand trembled when she zoomed in on one picture. Behind them, barely visible in the misty background, was the masked man. He had followed them from the haunted house. Mateo grabbed a kitchen knife, his usual bravado stripped away by the encroaching dread. Let's just wait it out, he suggested, his voice cracking. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, a loud bang erupted from the back door, as though someone, or something, was trying to force it open. The friends huddled together, hearts racing. Jason called the police, whispering the situation as quietly as he could. Then, the banging stopped. Silence enveloped the house. But before relief could set in, they heard a slow, deliberate scraping sound coming from the upstairs hallway. Leah stifled a sob. The intruder wasn't at the door anymore. He was inside. Sirens pierced the night air, and the flashing red and blue lights flooded the front yard. The friends bolted for the door as police officers stormed inside. The officers searched every room, but found no trace of the masked man. The only clue left behind was a dusty black hat lying in the center of Leah's bedroom floor. To this day, none of them visit Fear Manor, and they never forget the lesson that still haunts their nightmares. Sometimes, when you chase fear for fun, it might decide to follow you home. Story number 7, The Nightmare House. Our new home came with a terrifying secret. When the Rivera family first moved into their charming, two-story home in the quiet town of Willow Springs, it seemed like a dream come true. The house had everything: a sprawling backyard, a cozy fireplace, and a neighborhood full of friendly faces. Diego and Carmen Rivera, along with their two children, Eva and little Lucas, were excited to settle into their new life. But their dream quickly turned into a nightmare. It started on their very first night. Ava, a teenager with a love for all things supernatural, brushed off the faint tapping noises she heard outside her bedroom window. It's probably just the wind, she reassured herself, curling deeper into her blankets. But the wind couldn't explain the sound of footsteps on the front porch, slow, deliberate, and haunting. The next morning, Carmen noticed something strange. The welcome mat was flipped upside down, and muddy footprints trailed from the porch steps to the front door. Must have been some pranksters, Diego muttered, dismissing it as a harmless mischief. Still, he couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. As the days went by, the late night disturbances only worsened. Every evening, at precisely 11:11 p.m., a loud, rhythmic knock echoed through the house, always coming from the front door. When Diego or Carmen would peek through the peephole, no one was there. Ava, curious and fearless, recorded the sounds on her phone and even tried staying up to catch the culprit. But all she captured was an empty street under the eerie glow of the street lamps. Things escalated one stormy night when Lucas, only 6 years old, ran into his parents' room, crying. "There's a man outside my window," he sobbed, his small body trembling. Diego rushed to the boy's room, but again, there was nothing, just sheets of rain pelting the glass and the rustling of tree branches. Carmen tried to soothe Lucas, but his words left a chill in the room. He said he was waiting for us. Diego finally decided to install security cameras around the house. That night, as the clock struck 11:11, the familiar knocking began. Diego watched the footage on his phone, his hands trembling. The cameras showed something impossible: the door knocker moving up and down, yet no one was standing in front of it. Frustrated and terrified, the Riveras called a local handyman to inspect the property. The man, a lifelong resident of Willow Springs, grew pale as they described the occurrences. "This house," he whispered, "it used to belong to the Grays. They vanished one night, years ago. No one knows what happened, but folks around here say the spirits come back, looking for new owners." That evening, Ava did some digging online and uncovered old newspaper clippings. The Grays had indeed disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind unanswered questions and rumors of a cursed house. Ava's curiosity was replaced with a deep, paralyzing fear. On their final night in the house, the knocking grew violent, shaking the front door on its hinges. The family huddled together, their packed suitcases ready by the door. Suddenly, the front door swung open, and a cold gust of wind blew through the house. Diego grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the darkness. But all he saw were two shadowy figures at the edge of the yard, standing impossibly still. The Riveras didn't wait to see what happened next. They piled into their car and sped away, leaving the nightmare house behind. The next day, as the sun rose over Willow Springs, a new family pulled into the driveway, marveling at their new home. The Riveras knew they couldn't stop them, but they whispered a silent prayer that this time the house's secrets would remain buried. And if anyone ever hears a knock at 11:11 p.m., they'll know to leave before it's too late. Story number 8: Haunted House Horror. The masked figure that followed us home. It was supposed to be a night full of scares and laughter. Madison, her best friend Lexi, and Lexi's boyfriend Jake had planned their Halloween evening down to the last detail, hit the haunted house attraction on the outskirts of town, then grab late night pizza and binge horror movies at Lexi's place, dressed in costumes, a witch, a vampire, and a zombie. They were ready to embrace the thrill. The haunted house was notorious for being the most terrifying in the city, attracting adrenaline junkies and horror enthusiasts alike. As the trio stepped inside, they were greeted by flashing strobe lights, walls dripping with fake blood, and actors jumping out from every shadow. Madison was on edge, but loved the rush. She screamed, laughed, and clung to Lexi as they moved through the maze of horrors. Toward the end of the attraction, they entered a pitch black room where they had to navigate by touch. It was disorienting, and every step felt uncertain. Suddenly, a masked actor appeared, standing mere inches from Madison. The mask was unnervingly realistic, resembling a pale, expressionless face with hollow eyes. Madison let out a genuine scream as the figure tilted its head, not saying a word. The eerie silence was unsettling, and even after the group rushed out of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Once they emerged from the haunted house, they laughed off the experience, teasing each other about who screamed the loudest. That mask guy got you good, Mads, Jake joked, nudging her. Madison forced a laugh, trying to brush off the unease that clung to her like a shadow. They made their way to Lexi's car, the parking lot almost empty now, and started driving home. Madison glanced out the back window and froze. Guys, she said, her voice trembling. I think someone's following us. Lexi checked the rearview mirror, but the street behind them appeared empty. Jake shrugged. Relax. It's just your imagination. But Madison couldn't relax. When they stopped at a red light, she spotted him, the same masked figure from the haunted house, standing under a flickering streetlight. His head was tilted just as before, and he was staring straight at them. Madison's heart pounded in her chest. Look, she whispered. But as Lexi turned to see, the figure had vanished. Back at Lexi's house, they tried to shake off the paranoia. Madison was jittery, double-checking the locks on every door. Jake made fun of her. You're letting that actor get to you, Mads. But deep down, Madison knew this wasn't just a lingering scare. Something felt wrong. As they settled on the couch for their movie marathon, the sense of unease only grew. Halfway through their first film, a loud knock echoed from the front door. Everyone went silent. The movie's jump scare suddenly irrelevant. Probably just trick-or-treaters, Lexi reasoned. Though it was well past midnight, Jake got up to answer the door. But when he opened it, no one was there. The three friends exchanged nervous glances, a cold dread settling over the room. Madison peeked through the window, her breath catching in her throat. Standing at the end of the driveway, barely visible in the glow of the street lamp, was the masked figure. This time, he took a step forward. Panicked, they called the police, who arrived quickly, but found no sign of the stalker. The officers assured them it was probably a Halloween prank, but Madison wasn't convinced. The figure's haunting, silent presence felt too real, too personal. That night, Madison barely slept, and the next morning, she found muddy footprints leading up to her bedroom window. The mask's empty eyes haunted her dreams for weeks, and the three friends never went back to that haunted house attraction. To this day, Madison wonders if the masked figure ever stopped watching or if he's just waiting for the perfect moment to return. Make sure to subscribe for more terrifying stories and hit the bell icon to never miss an update. Don't forget to like, comment, and share these stories with your friends to keep the spooky spirit alive. Story 1: The Haunting Hunt, a father's desperate run for survival in the wild. Tom Rivers was excited. After years of solo hunting trips, he was finally taking his 14-year-old daughter, Emily, on her first big adventure. They'd planned for weeks, stocking up on gear and talking through safety tips, hoping to make this a memorable experience. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, with nothing but the forest around them, it was meant to be the perfect escape. Just father and daughter, connecting with nature. But as dawn broke over the trees, Tom sensed something was off. The forest was unusually quiet, with even the birds and insects seemingly muted. The pair continued along the trail, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to nerves about Emily's safety, and tried to refocus on their hunt. A few hours into their hike, they came upon a man standing just off the trail, partially hidden by trees. He was tall and unkempt, with clothes that looked like they'd been worn for weeks. His gaze was vacant, yet intense, as though he could see right through them. Tom felt a chill run down his spine, but he nodded politely, hoping to keep things civil. The stranger didn't respond. He just stared, his mouth curled into an eerie smile. Tom whispered to Emily to stay close and kept moving. But something about the man's presence felt wrong, almost predatory. As they continued, Tom noticed the man shadowing them at a distance, disappearing behind trees and then reappearing further along the trail. Every time Tom glanced back, there he was, closer than before, the unsettling grin still on his face. Then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, Tom's heart dropped. There, in the underbrush, was a human head, eyes wide open in terror, mouth frozen mid-scream. It looked recent, the features still discernible, the skin a sickly gray under the forest light. Emily gasped, clutching her father's arm as she stifled a scream. Tom knew they had to leave, and fast. Trying to stay calm, he whispered to Emily to follow his lead, moving back toward their car as quietly as possible. But before they could retreat, the man stepped out from behind a tree, blocking their path, his dark eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. He tilted his head as if relishing their fear. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice low and chilling. Tom tightened his grip on his hunting knife, adrenaline surging as he shielded Emily behind him. He knew he couldn't risk a confrontation, not with his daughter at his side. "We're just passing through," he said, keeping his voice steady. But the man took a step forward, unfazed. In a sudden burst of courage, Tom grabbed Emily's hand and bolted, pulling her down the trail as fast as they could run. The sound of heavy footsteps crashed behind them, leaves and branches snapping as the stranger chased after them. Tom's mind raced with panic, every instinct focused on keeping Emily safe. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached their truck. Tom shoved Emily inside and leaped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys in his trembling hands. The stranger appeared at the edge of the clearing, watching as they sped away. His twisted smile burned into Tom's memory. Even now, back home, Tom is haunted by the memory of that man and the lifeless eyes of the severed head they stumbled upon. What should have been a bonding trip became a nightmare they'll never forget. They never returned to those woods again. And to this day, Tom wonders how close they came to becoming the next victims of the wilderness. Story 2: The Dark Ritual. Friends' camping trip turns into a battle for survival. A camping trip was all it was supposed to be, an escape from city life, a weekend of peace and fresh air in the remote mountains of Oregon. Jacob Fields, along with his friends Mark and Sam, had packed their bags with everything they'd need: food, tents, fishing gear, and enough firewood for endless stories by the fire. But nothing could have prepared them for the horrors that lay hidden in the misty wilderness. On their first day, they trekked deep into the woods, far from any marked trails. They wanted isolation, a place where they could truly be alone. By evening, they found a spot near a glistening stream and quickly set up camp. The forest was quiet, and for a moment it felt like they'd found a little slice of paradise. But as darkness crept in, the woods around them seemed to change. The shadows grew deeper, and the silence became oppressive. As the group sat around the fire, a figure emerged from the trees. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, his voice low and unsettling. Taken aback, Jacob glanced at his friends. Mark gave a hesitant nod, and the stranger sat down beside them, his gaze fixed intently on the fire. The man introduced himself as Earl and spoke with a strange, almost trance-like quality. He shared cryptic tales about the forest, hinting at dark rituals that had taken place long before their time. His words sent chills down their spines, but they chalked it up to the eerie atmosphere and the isolation. Eventually, he stood up, nodded in their direction, and disappeared back into the trees as mysteriously as he had appeared. Unnerved but trying to shake it off, the friends turned in for the night, but their sleep was broken by strange noises, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to echo through the woods. Jacob crawled out of his tent to see shadowy figures moving through the trees, carrying flickering torches. He quickly woke Mark and Sam, whispering about the bizarre ritual unfolding around them. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Jacob's arm and his vision blurred. He barely registered a prick from something sharp before he collapsed to the ground, his senses numbing. Mark and Sam met a similar fate, each succumbing to a drug-induced haze as they were dragged from the campsite. When Jacob regained consciousness, he found himself in a cold, dimly lit cabin, his hands bound. Mark and Sam lay nearby, still groggy and disoriented. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. Fear took hold as they realized they were prisoners of a shadowy cult whose members began chanting once again, eyes glazed in reverence for some dark, unknown entity. Desperate and fueled by adrenaline, Jacob managed to loosen the ropes binding him. He motioned for Mark and Sam to do the same, but time was running out. The cult members were preparing something in a corner of the cabin, muttering ominously. As one cultist stepped forward, a knife gleaming in the firelight, Jacob saw his only chance. With a burst of energy, he tackled the cultist, yelling for his friends to run. The three friends broke free, stumbling into the woods, their hearts pounding as they darted between trees, desperate to escape. They ran through the night, driven by the primal instinct to survive. When they finally reached their truck at the forest's edge, they didn't look back. They drove for hours, not stopping until they were miles from that cursed place. The ordeal left deep scars, both physical and mental. To this day, Jacob refuses to return to any remote campsite. He still dreams of those hollow eyes staring back at him, and he knows he and his friends escaped by the narrowest of margins. For them, the forest holds a darkness that will haunt them forever. Story 3. A Dark Discovery. Hunter's Night Encounter with the Wood's Deadliest Secret. Ethan Blake had always considered himself a seasoned hunter. He'd grown up navigating the dense forests of Louisiana, tracking game by day and night without a second thought. But one evening on a solo hunt for wild boar, he stumbled upon something so sinister that it would shatter his confidence forever. The night was unusually still as Ethan moved through the thick underbrush, his flashlight casting narrow beams through the darkness. He'd been tracking a boar for hours, listening for the faintest rustle, every sense heightened. Just as he was about to give up and return to his truck, he noticed movement in the distance. A figure slowly making its way through the trees. Curious but cautious, Ethan dimmed his flashlight and crept forward, careful not to make a sound. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate pace, dragging something heavy behind him. Ethan squinted, trying to make out what it was. His stomach dropped when he realized the figure was pulling a long, dark bag, one that looked suspiciously like it held a body. Frozen in shock, Ethan watched as the man stopped and bent down, muttering something under his breath. The words were inaudible, but the tone was low and menacing. A chill crept down Ethan's spine. He'd stumbled upon something far darker than any wild animal. He considered turning back, pretending he hadn't seen anything, but a mix of adrenaline and curiosity urged him forward. He adjusted his flashlight, pointing it just enough to illuminate the figure from a distance without giving away his own position. The man was tall, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes that reflected the flashlight's faint glow. When he turned to drag the bag again, Ethan caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. A pair of lifeless eyes peeking out from the unzipped edge of the bag. Ethan's mind raced. Who was this man? And who or what was he dragging through the woods? His instincts screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Just as he was about to turn and leave, a twig snapped beneath his foot. The man froze, his head snapping up as he scanned the darkness, eyes narrowing. In a split-second decision, Ethan stepped out of the shadows, flashlight raised. "Hey!" he called out, hoping to intimidate the man. But instead of fleeing or explaining himself, the man just grinned, a twisted, joyless smile that made Ethan's stomach churn. "What are you doing out here, friend?" the stranger drawled, his voice dripping with menace. Ethan steadied himself, heart pounding, and demanded, "What's in the bag?" The stranger's grin widened, and without a word, He dropped the bag, stepping closer to Ethan. Every instinct screamed for him to retreat, but the man's gaze held him in place, his cold, unblinking eyes promising something far worse than any encounter with a wild animal. "You don't want to know," the man whispered, his voice barely a murmur. "But since you're so curious..." He lunged toward Ethan, and in that split second, adrenaline took over. Ethan stumbled back, raising his flashlight as a makeshift weapon. The man's hand grazed him, and Ethan spun around, breaking into a sprint. He didn't dare look back, his only focus on escaping the clutches of the predator lurking behind him. Branches tore at his arms and face as he ran, heart racing with terror, each breath feeling like it could be his last. Finally, he spotted his truck in the distance, relief flooding him as he reached the door, fumbled with his keys and jumped inside. Peeling out of the forest, he didn't stop until he was miles away, the man's twisted grin still etched into his memory. Ethan has never returned to that part of the woods, haunted by the knowledge that some things lurking in the darkness are far more dangerous than any wild animal. He knows he barely escaped with his life, and he's still haunted by the question of who or what was in that body bag. Please like, share, and subscribe. Story 1: The Creepy Cabin of Pine Hollow. A terrifying tale of twin sisters who entered and barely escaped in a small, fog-covered town hidden deep within the dense pines of Pine Hollow. There stood an abandoned, eerie cabin. Locals whispered about its tragic history, a place of disappearances and shadows, avoided by nearly everyone in the area. But for twin sisters Lena and Riley, curiosity overpowered caution. They'd heard the rumors at school, where classmates dared each other to step inside. The cabin was supposed to be haunted by something ancient and vengeful. As the sisters crept through the woods that night, with only the moonlight filtering through the branches, their hearts pounded with both fear and excitement. As soon as they reached the cabin, an uneasy silence enveloped them. The air felt thick, damp, and somehow charged. Lena hesitated, noticing how dark the windows were, like empty eyes staring back. But Riley, the braver of the two, gently pushed the door, which creaked open slowly, almost as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. The cold air made their skin prickle, and each step sent eerie echoes across the room. The girls held their breath as they explored the shadowed corners, feeling as if someone, or something, was watching their every move. And then they heard it, a faint whisper, as if coming from just beyond the walls. "Did you hear that?" Lena's voice was barely audible, her face pale with fear. They listened, hearts hammering, and the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Get out!" The words froze them in place. Riley grabbed Lena's hand, ready to bolt, but as they turned, they saw it. A shadow, barely visible in the dim light, slipping across the far wall. It was tall, with long, claw-like hands, and seemed to float just above the ground. The figure didn't move toward them, but it seemed to shift and pulse, as if feeding on their fear. Panicking, they backed up, knocking into a small wooden table that toppled with a loud crash. Echoing in the silence, the shadow seemed to react, flickering and growing darker. They could feel it closing in, the room chilling further as the figure's low growl filled the air. The walls seemed to breathe, as if the house itself was alive, trapping them in its icy grip. With a sudden surge of courage, Lena grabbed her sister's hand, pulling her toward the door. They stumbled outside, barely able to breathe as they tore through the trees, branches snagging their clothes and scratching their faces. Behind them, a faint whisper echoed through the woods one last time, chilling them to the bone. "Come back." The sisters never spoke of what they'd seen that night. Not to each other, not to anyone, but whenever they passed by those shadowed woods, they'd feel the same cold shiver, as if the haunted cabin was calling them, waiting, longing for their return. Story 2. The Echoing Shadows of Hallway 13. A chilling encounter in the abandoned school bathroom. Every town has its legends, and in the sleepy, windswept town of Reading, there was an old high school with an infamous reputation. The eerie tales centered around Hallway 13, a narrow, forgotten corridor leading to a restroom that had been abandoned years ago after a terrible accident. No one knew the details, but students whispered about how strange sounds and ghostly sightings plagued anyone who dared to enter. One rainy afternoon, Jenny, a new transfer student, was struggling to find a restroom. She stumbled upon Hallway 13, dim and nearly hidden from sight. The rain was pouring, thunder rumbling outside, and the main bathroom was locked. Though every instinct screamed to turn back, she was in a hurry, and the silence of Hallway 13 seemed welcoming compared to the storm outside. As she entered, the dim, flickering lights gave the restroom an eerie, hazy glow. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint, metallic smell, like old pipes mixed with something sour. She thought she heard faint footsteps behind her, but dismissed it, assuming it was the rain echoing in the empty hallway. Jenny hurried into one of the stalls, shutting the door with a creak. But as soon as she was inside, an unsettling sensation washed over her. She felt as though someone, or something, was watching. She glanced under the stall, expecting to see feet, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded harder with each passing second, but she tried to calm herself, attributing the eerie feeling to her nerves and the room's dismal lighting. Then, the lights began to flicker more erratically, plunging the room into darkness before blinking back on. Shadows danced across the restroom walls, their shapes twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. One shadow in particular caught her eye. It was tall, with distorted features, and it seemed to be moving closer. A faint whisper echoed around her, barely above a murmur. "Get out." Jenny froze, her skin crawling. She was now sure she wasn't alone. She could hear faint, irregular breathing, but no footsteps, no movement other than the flickering lights and shifting shadows. She tried to calm herself, rationalizing that maybe it was just an electrical fault. But the whispers continued, filling her with a creeping dread that tightened her chest. When she finally gathered the courage to leave the stall, she moved quickly, desperate to reach the door. But as she caught a glimpse of the restroom mirror, her blood turned cold. Reflected behind her was a figure, tall, dark, and looming. Its face was twisted, with hollow eyes and a wide, twisted smile, watching her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. With a scream, Jenny bolted for the door, throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway. She didn't stop running until she reached the main hallway. Breathless and pale, she tried to explain what she'd seen, but her words faltered, her mind still gripped by the horror she'd just experienced. Since that night, Jenny never ventured near Hallway 13 again, and the few students who dared visit reported the same feeling, a presence lurking, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to wander in. Story 3. A Deadly Confession. How two backpackers uncovered the sinister secret of a criminal kingpin. It was supposed to be an adventure of a lifetime for Evan and Sarah, two friends fresh out of college, backpacking across remote regions of South America. The culture, the mountains, the hidden villages, they wanted to experience it all. But what they didn't know was that one seemingly innocent encounter would lead them into the dark world of a powerful criminal, leaving them changed forever. Their troubles began when they reached San Miguel, a small, bustling town nestled deep in the mountains. A local man known as Don Victor offered them a room in his large, rustic villa at the edge of town. He seemed generous, his charm disarming, and he offered them wine and stories of the town's history. But as the evening wore on, his tales grew darker, hinting at his shadowy past. Evan and Sarah laughed it off, attributing his mysterious air to the late hour and too much wine. But when Don Victor invited them on a tour of his estate the next day, they couldn't resist the offer. The next morning, as they wandered through the villa, Don Victor took them to an underground wine cellar that seemed older than the house itself. Flickering lights illuminated rows of wine barrels, creating long shadows that danced eerily on the damp stone walls. As they moved deeper into the cellar, they noticed something odd: a heavy, locked metal door with no apparent handle. Evan's curiosity got the better of him, and he asked, "What's behind there?" Don Victor's expression shifted, his smile fading as his eyes darkened. He motioned them closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What I'm about to tell you," he murmured, "is not something you can ever share." The tension was palpable as Don Victor recounted his story. He revealed that years ago, he had been one of the most feared drug lords in South America, his empire spanning continents. But it wasn't the drugs or money that fueled his power. It was something far more sinister. Behind that metal door was a room where he had made countless sacrifices to a dark figure he called El Hombre de la Sombra, the Man of Shadows. He claimed that these rituals were what brought him fortune and protection, binding his empire to something unearthly. Evan and Sarah's eyes widened in horror as Don Victor continued, his voice steady but chillingly cold. He spoke of the people he had brought into that room, never to be seen again. The sacrifices, he said, were the true reason for his continued influence. Even though he had long since retired, he laughed as he noted how even now, locals were still terrified of crossing him. Realizing the danger they were in, Evan and Sarah exchanged nervous glances. They were trapped in the cellar with a man who had just confessed to horrors they could barely comprehend. And then, Don Victor's gaze turned to them, a sinister glint in his eyes. He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You're safe for now," he said, a cruel smile on his lips, "as long as you never speak of this." The two friends stumbled back, murmuring promises to keep his secret as they made their way back up to the surface. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to escape the villa as quickly as possible. They managed to get to the village square, their minds reeling, and boarded the first bus out of San Miguel without looking back. It wasn't until they were miles away that they finally spoke, still haunted by the darkness they'd left behind. And while they eventually went their separate ways, neither Evan nor Sarah ever truly escaped that night. Both lived with the shadow of Don Victor's secrets, forever haunted by what lay behind that locked door. Story 4: The Shadow at My Window. A terrifying true encounter that still haunts me. It was during my junior year of high school when I moved into a small, old rental house on the edge of town with my mom. The neighborhood was quiet and mostly empty. With streetlights that barely worked and an eerie stillness that blanketed the streets after sunset. The first few nights were peaceful, and I figured the silence would be perfect for studying. But then, the strange events started. It began innocently enough. I'd be studying in my room when I'd hear a faint knock at the window, always around midnight. At first, I thought it'd be just the wind rattling on the glass, but the knocking was rhythmic. 3 soft taps, then silence, as if someone were testing whether I'd noticed. I checked the window a few times, but each time, there was nothing there but darkness. I chalked it up to my imagination, probably fueled by my late-night study sessions. But then, I started noticing subtle shadows moving across my curtains, even though no one else was home. Sometimes, it felt as if something were standing just outside, watching. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was all just in my head. But each night, the knocks returned, growing louder and more persistent. One particularly cold night, I heard not only the knocks, but also a strange scraping sound, like someone dragging their fingers down the glass. My heart pounded as I forced myself to glance at the window. Nothing was there, but the shadow lingered, growing darker and more defined, almost as if it were taunting me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and waited for it to disappear. But when I opened my eyes again, I felt a chill race down my spine. The shadow seemed to be pressing closer to the window, taking shape. The next day I tried to tell my mom, but she brushed it off as stress. That night, I pulled the blinds down, hoping it would make me feel safer. But around midnight, the tapping returned, followed by a whisper so faint, it was almost inaudible. It was calling my name. Desperate, I grabbed my phone and quickly snapped a photo through a tiny gap in the blinds, hoping to capture whatever was out there. When I looked at the image, my blood went cold. There was a faint outline of a figure standing inches from the glass, a tall, shadowy form with hollow eyes, its face twisted in an expression I couldn't decipher. It felt like it was looking straight through me. Terrified, I stayed up all night with the lights on, but the tapping continued until dawn. I avoided my room after dark from then on, only sleeping in the living room, where the lights and TV drowned out any sounds. Eventually, the visits stopped, and I managed to convince myself it had been some sort of elaborate prank, or just stress playing tricks on me. But every so often, I'd hear that soft tapping again, even if just faintly, and on the nights I heard it, I'd feel that same dread, the overwhelming feeling of being watched by something that still lingered, waiting for me to return to that window. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Story number 1, The Enigmatic Flash Drive. Secrets of the Vanished Stranger. When 20-year-old college student Megan stumbled upon a flash drive left in a campus library cubicle, she initially thought it was just a lucky find. But what she discovered on that tiny device would haunt her, leaving her questioning who left it and why. Megan had been studying late that night in the near-empty library. It was nearing midnight when she packed her things to leave, only to spot a small black flash drive sticking out from under a nearby desk. Assuming someone must have left it by mistake, Megan slipped it into her bag, deciding she'd take a quick look to see if she could identify the owner. When she got back to her apartment, curiosity got the better of her. She plugged the flash drive into her laptop and opened the first file. Her screen flooded with photographs, hundreds of images of her college campus, taken from angles she'd never seen before. They were eerily detailed, the shadowed corners of buildings, empty hallways at night, and even photos of specific study cubicles, including the very one she'd been in earlier. A chill ran down her spine when she spotted a photo taken directly outside her dorm room window. Each picture looked like it had been taken in secret, with a strange, voyeuristic quality. As Megan scrolled through the files, she found herself increasingly uneasy. It was as if she was seeing her world through the eyes of someone lurking. Then Megan stumbled upon a folder labeled The Chosen. Inside, she found a series of cryptic notes and documents. One file was a list of names, and her own name appeared halfway down. The dates and times beside each name seemed random at first, but then she realized each date corresponded to times she'd been alone, late at night on campus. Her heart raced as she realized this stranger had been tracking her movements. But why? The last file was a video, shaky and poorly lit. In it, a shadowy figure, his face obscured, whispered incoherently as he filmed Megan from a distance. She was there, studying late in the library, completely unaware of being watched. The final moments showed him slowly approaching her study cubicle before the screen cut to black. Terrified, Megan shut her laptop and sat in silence, listening to her own ragged breathing. Every noise in her apartment felt amplified. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards. She realized that whoever had left the flash drive knew where she lived and was possibly still watching her, waiting. Megan reported the incident to campus security, but they found no evidence of the person on the drive or any clue to his identity. Haunted by the images and the chilling sense of being watched, Megan became paranoid, avoiding any secluded places on campus and never studying alone again. The flash drive vanished soon after, seemingly taking its secrets with it, but to this day, Megan can't shake the feeling that she's still being followed by eyes she can't see. Who was he, she wonders, and why was I chosen? Story number 2, The Haunting of Grayson's Basement, A Night of Terror. Below, Grayson and his best friend Josh had always been thrill seekers, but this time, their curiosity led them somewhere far darker. Grayson's family had recently moved into an old, creaky house on the outskirts of town, with a basement that seemed to have a life of its own. From the moment Grayson saw it, he knew there was something off about that space. The thick, stale air, the shadows that seemed to dance in the corners. But it was one particular night when he and Josh finally dared each other to investigate that their worst fears came to life. It was late, and the rest of Grayson's family was asleep, armed with nothing but their flashlights and phones to capture any ghostly evidence. Grayson and Josh crept down the basement stairs. The wooden steps groaned underfoot, adding to the tense atmosphere as the boys descended into near darkness. Once at the bottom, Grayson clicked on his flashlight, illuminating rows of dusty shelves filled with old forgotten boxes and peeling wallpaper barely clinging to the walls. They began filming, joking nervously to break the tension, but the deeper they explored, the colder the room seemed to become. Suddenly, they heard a faint whisper, like a distant breeze moving through the room, though there were no windows and no way in or out except the staircase. They froze, glancing at each other with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" Josh whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," Grayson replied, his heart pounding. "It's coming from over there." He pointed to the darkest corner of the basement, where an old, heavy tarp draped over what looked like an old chest or workbench. With shaky hands, Grayson raised his flashlight, focusing on the corner. Just as the light settled, a figure began to take shape. At first, it was only a shadow, barely visible. But as they stared, the figure became more distinct. Tall, thin, and slightly hunched. Its form twisted in a way that seemed unnatural, almost otherworldly. Before they could make sense of what they were seeing, the figure's eyes opened, revealing 2 glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto them with an unnatural intensity. The boys stood frozen, fear rooting them to the spot as the shadow seemed to glide forward, making no sound, yet somehow filling the entire room with a sinister, suffocating energy. Josh stammered, We need to go now." But Grayson couldn't move. It was as if the figure's gaze held him captive, paralyzing him with terror. In a final burst of willpower, Josh grabbed Grayson's arm, and yanked him toward the stairs. They scrambled up. The entity's glowing eyes burned into their memories as it followed them with unnatural speed, stopping only at the base of the stairs as they stumbled into the hallway above. The basement door slammed shut behind them, rattling violently as if something from the other side wanted out. The boys didn't look back. They ran out of the house, breathless and shaken, their hearts racing. Grayson never returned to that basement again, and to this day, he won't speak about what he saw. Sometimes, some doors are better left unopened. Story number 3. The Shadow in the Park. A chilling encounter at Maplewood Trails. It was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon for Mia, a high school senior who often went to Maplewood Trails to clear her head. The park was quiet, with just a few dog walkers and joggers scattered along the path. Golden leaves drifted down from the trees, and a cool breeze filled the air, hinting at the crispness of fall. Mia strolled along the path, her thoughts wandering, when she first noticed him. At the far edge of the trail, near the old abandoned playground, stood a tall, gaunt man. He seemed out of place, wearing a dark trench coat that looked too heavy for the mild weather. At first, she thought he might just be another park goer, but something about his stance was unsettling. He was standing perfectly still, staring at her with an intense gaze that made her skin crawl. Mia glanced away, hoping it was just a coincidence, but as she continued down the path, the man began to walk too, mirroring her pace at a distance. Every time she looked over her shoulder, he was there, matching her steps, his eyes fixed on her like he was studying her every move. His face held a strange, almost unnatural expression, his mouth slightly curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Picking up her pace, Mia turned onto a different trail that led deeper into the woods, hoping to lose him. But as she hurried along, she realized the man had done the same, his pace quickening in response. The faster she walked, the closer he seemed to get. She could hear his footsteps crunching on the leaves behind her, sending a chill down her spine. Finally, she reached a small clearing near the creek where she felt safer, thinking he wouldn't follow. But to her horror, she saw him standing just beyond the tree line, leaning against a trunk and watching her with that same chilling smile. This time, he raised a hand and waved slowly, his fingers twitching oddly, as if each movement was deliberate and practiced. "Are you lost?" he called out, his voice low and rasping, carrying an unnatural calmness that made her stomach drop. "I can show you the way out." Her heart raced as she forced a smile and muttered, "No, I'm fine, thank you." The man tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he continued to watch her, an unsettling stillness in his gaze. "You seem nervous," he said, taking a slow step forward. "There's no need to be. I've been waiting for someone like you." A surge of panic gripped Mia. Without another word, she turned and bolted down the path, her feet pounding against the earth as she raced toward the entrance of the park. Behind her, she could hear his footsteps quicken, the once soft crunching turning into frantic pounding. She ran faster than she ever had, adrenaline fueling her as she sprinted past the trees, glancing back just once to see his figure disappearing into the shadows, his unsettling smile lingering in her mind. Only when she reached the edge of the park, where a few families were walking nearby, did she feel remotely safe. To this day, Mia avoids Maplewood Trails, haunted by the memory of the man and his sinister smile. She can't shake the feeling that he might still be out there, waiting, watching. "Be careful who you meet in the park," she warns. Some encounters are far more than they seem. Story number 4. The Closet Watcher. A night of terror in my own bedroom, Ella had always been comfortable in her small studio apartment. It was her first real space of independence, a cozy, sunlit corner in a quiet building on the outskirts of the city. But over the past few weeks, that sense of comfort had faded, replaced by an unexplainable tension. Every time she walked into her room, she started noticing small, unsettling changes. A book moved out of place, the closet door slightly ajar when she was sure she'd closed it, and an eerie, faint scent that seemed to linger near the closet. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe she'd forgotten to close the door properly or knocked the book off the nightstand without realizing it. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences only increased. Every night, around the same time, she would hear faint scratching sounds, like fingernails tapping against a hard surface. Coming from the direction of the closet, the noise was so subtle, she thought it might be her imagination. But deep down, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. One evening, determined to put her nerves to rest, she thoroughly checked the closet. She pushed her clothes aside, peered into the dark corners, and even climbed up to check the dusty shelf above. Nothing. She let out a nervous laugh, convincing herself it was all in her head, just a product of stress and lack of sleep. Yet as she lay in bed that night, the scratching returned, louder this time, and definitely coming from the closet. Ella lay motionless, her heart racing as the scratching persisted, more insistent, almost purposeful. Her eyes stayed fixed on the closet door, half open and shadowed in the dim light. As she lay there, too terrified to move, she thought she could see a figure lurking behind the clothes, a dark outline barely visible. Her pulse quickened, and a shiver ran down her spine as she realized she was no longer alone. In a panic, Ella reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she turned on the flashlight. A thin beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the room. But as she pointed it toward the closet, the scratching abruptly stopped. She held her breath, straining to hear any sound, but the room was silent. She slowly swung her legs over the bed, determined to face whatever was hiding in her closet once and for all. As she approached the closet, she could feel her skin prickling, the air thick with an ominous energy. She held her phone out, her fingers cold and shaky as she reached for the closet door. With a quick, determined motion, she yanked it fully open and shone the light inside. At first, all she saw were her clothes hanging limply. Then, in the back corner, barely visible, she spotted him. A man crouched in the shadows, his face twisted into a sinister grin, his eyes wide with a deranged gleam. He didn't move, just watched her, his gaze unblinking, as if daring her to come closer. Ella's scream tore through the silence as she stumbled back. Dropping her phone in her panic, she bolted for the front door, her heart pounding as she threw it open and ran into the hallway, screaming for help. Her neighbors rushed out. The closet was empty, no trace of the man, no evidence of forced entry, just that scent lingering in the air. To this day, Ella refuses to sleep with her closet door even slightly open, and the scariest monsters are the ones hiding where you least expect them, she warns. Story number 1. The Shadow in the Locker Room. A game night mystery. Ethan, a senior on his high school soccer team, had played his heart out that evening. The game was close, but his team managed to win by a single goal in the last few minutes. Exhausted and exhilarated, He stayed behind in the locker room after everyone else had cleared out. The adrenaline rush was fading, leaving only the quiet, empty echo of the space around him, usually filled with laughter and banter. The locker room now felt eerie and uncomfortably silent. As he changed out of his gear, he began hearing faint, shuffling footsteps down the tiled hallway. Thinking a teammate might have returned for something, he called out, "Hey, who's still here?" Silence. There was no response, just the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from a row of lockers across the room. It was subtle, almost like someone lightly scraping metal from the inside. His pulse quickened, and a chill ran down his spine. But he tried to brush it off as maybe a mouse or loose equipment shifting. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. He glanced around the empty room, noting his teammates' bags and water bottles left lying on the benches, but no sign of anyone else. Gathering his courage, Ethan approached the row of lockers, heart pounding. "Is this some kind of prank?" he muttered, half expecting one of his friends to pop out and startle him. But as he reached for the locker door, an odd, heavy feeling settled over him, a gut instinct that he was not alone. With a deep breath, he swung the door open. Inside the locker, staring back at him, was a figure, its face shrouded in shadows, hollow eyes wide open and fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. It was motionless, almost statue-like, yet there was a strange energy to it, a quiet menace that sent a wave of fear through him. Ethan stumbled backward, unable to look away from those hollow eyes. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat, paralyzed by the terror gripping him. As he backed away, the locker door slowly creaked shut, the scratching sound resuming, softer now, as if it were retreating back into the locker's depths. Ethan's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he looked around. The bags and water bottles were still there, untouched and abandoned, as if his teammates had vanished into thin air. Realizing he had to get out, Ethan grabbed his things and bolted, his footsteps echoing down the empty halls as he raced out of the locker room. Even as he reached his car, he couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching him, that strange figure lurking just beyond the door. Days later, Ethan tried to talk to his friends about it, but they shrugged it off, saying he must have imagined it in the adrenaline of the game. Yet he couldn't let it go. Every time he stepped into that locker room, he felt the same creeping dread, as though something was waiting, hidden in the shadows, watching him. To this day, he avoids going back after dark, haunted by that terrifying encounter and the mystery of what really happened that night. Sometimes, things left in the locker room are better left alone, he warns. You never know who or what might still be there. Story number 2, The Forest Stalkers, A Walk to Remember. After weeks of long practices and tough games, Jake, a young football player, wanted a peaceful break. He planned a quiet night hike with his girlfriend, Mia, hoping to escape the noise and stress. They had often wandered the nearby forest trails under the moonlight, finding peace in the seclusion. That night seemed no different, just the two of them, surrounded by trees and stars, with only the sound of their footsteps on the trail. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Jake noticed a strange shift. The usual quiet of the forest felt heavier, the night air colder than usual, and then faintly they heard it. Laughter, not the playful kind, but a deep, unsettling chuckle that echoed through the trees. Jake's grip on Mia's hand tightened as he glanced around. She looked at him, her eyes wide with worry, and they slowed their pace, trying to convince themselves it was just someone else on a late-night walk. But then, shadowy figures emerged through the trees ahead of them, a group of men standing in a loose circle, muttering and shifting restlessly. They didn't appear to notice Jake and Mia at first, but the uneasy atmosphere around them sent a chill down Jake's spine. He didn't want to cause alarm, but every instinct screamed that something wasn't right. "Let's turn back," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Mia nodded, but just as they took a step backward, one of the men looked directly at them, his gaze intense and calculating. He whispered to the others, and they all turned, their faces partially obscured by shadows, yet unmistakably filled with a disturbing intent. The men started moving toward them, slowly at first, almost casually, but with each step Jake and Mia took, the men matched their pace, quickening and narrowing the gap between them. Heart racing, Jake grabbed Mia's hand, and together they broke into a sprint, trying to retrace their steps to the main path. The laughter followed, growing louder and closer with each step. Branches clawed at their clothes as they ran, the ground uneven and slippery beneath them. Jake could feel the men gaining, their footsteps thudding ominously just behind. He chanced to look back and saw shadows flickering, looming closer. Just as they spotted the faint glow of the road up ahead, Mia tripped, her ankle twisting as she stumbled on a loose stone, terror surging within him as they finally reached the edge of the trail. Under the streetlight's pale glow, they didn't stop running, and hearts pounding. Jake turned back one last time, swallowed by the dark trees. From that night on, the forest was no longer a place of peace for Jake and Mia. They couldn't shake the image of those men, the chilling laughter, and the haunting sense of being hunted. Jake still hears those footsteps and sees those shadowy figures in his nightmares. To this day, he warns anyone looking for a nighttime adventure. If you go wandering where you shouldn't, you might not be the only ones out there. Story number 3, The Baseball Field. Horror. When the game took a terrifying turn, it was supposed to be a casual Saturday afternoon, just a few friends gathering for a friendly baseball game at the local field. For Chris, a high school junior, it was the perfect break from the pressures of school and sports. The weather was perfect, the sky clear and blue, and there was nothing but the sound of the bat cracking against the ball as they warmed up. But as the game progressed, something began to feel off. The group of 6 friends was deep into the match, laughing and shouting as they ran the bases. That's when Chris first noticed it. Standing at the far edge of the field, just beyond the tree line, a group of men were watching the sim. At first, he assumed they were curious onlookers, or perhaps other locals enjoying the sunny day. However, the longer he stared, the more unsettling the figures became. They stood perfectly still, their faces hidden in shadow, unmoving. It felt wrong, like they weren't just there to watch. They were watching with purpose. As the game continued, Chris's unease grew. The men hadn't shifted position, nor had they said a word. They were like silent statues, their eyes seemingly fixed on the boys. Chris tried to ignore it, but the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Then, during a break between innings, one of the men moved. Slowly, unnervingly, he stepped forward, his long shadow stretching over the field as he approached the group. His face was obscured, hidden under the brim of a dark hat, but Chris could feel the weight of his gaze from across the field. The other figures followed him, stepping out of the trees, their movements slow and deliberate. It was then that Chris realized they weren't just standing there. They were closing in. His heart pounded in his chest as he motioned to his friends to stop. "We need to go now," he whispered urgently, panic creeping into his voice. The men hadn't said anything, but their silence was more terrifying than any words could be. The group of friends dropped their baseball bats and ran, their feet pounding against the dirt as they sprinted toward the parking lot. the men following them at a steady pace. Chris's mind raced as he glanced behind him. The men didn't run. They just walked, their steps echoing through the empty field. It felt like they were never getting closer, yet never falling behind. The boys reached the parking lot, breathless, jumping into their cars with shaky hands and locking the doors. When Chris looked out the window, the figures had stopped at the edge of the field, still watching, as if satisfied. They turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. To this day, Chris and his friends can't explain what happened. The men never spoke, never chased them directly, yet they never felt more hunted. No one had ever seen them around town again. That baseball field, once a place of fun and games, was now a place of dread. Every time Chris drives past it, he can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, lurking in the trees, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Story number 1. Locked in Fear, a math class nightmare that shook our school. The day began like any other Tuesday. Mrs. Harlow, our advanced algebra teacher, was handing out the day's practice sheets, and we were all groaning over the usual load of equations. Little did we know, by the end of the period, we'd be locked down, trembling in fear as our classroom transformed into a shelter from a real-life nightmare. Just after the first bell, an announcement crackled over the PA system, catching everyone off guard. Attention, teachers and students. This is a code red. We are in lockdown. Please secure your rooms immediately. There was a tense pause, and then, "This is not a drill." Those words sent a shockwave through the room. You could feel the collective heartbeat of the class speed up, a chorus of sharp breaths and frantic glances. Mrs. Harlow's face went pale as she immediately rushed to lock the door and close the blinds. We huddled together, sitting on the floor by the back wall, away from the windows and door, as she whispered for everyone to stay quiet. Even the class jokers didn't dare make a sound. A few rows back, I caught sight of Jordan, the loudest kid in our grade, clutching his notebook with shaking hands, his usual confidence replaced by raw fear. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. Our minds raced with questions. Who was out there? What did they want? Then came the footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. They echoed down the corridor, each one louder than the last. Each one closer. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed, as if even the smallest sound might give us away. I could see my friend Emma beside me, her eyes wide and glassy, holding back tears. A faint, muffled voice sounded from just outside the classroom door. It was impossible to make out the words, but there was something off about the tone. Frantic, yet low, almost like someone mumbling or arguing with themselves. As the footsteps stopped right outside, my heart felt like it would burst. The door handle rattled, then stopped. Another second of silence passed, and then a low, eerie scraping sound, like something metallic dragging against the wall. It was then that I caught sight of Miss Harlow, gripping a wooden ruler in her hand, as if it were a weapon, her face filled with a look of steely determination and fear. The scraping sound continued down the hall, slowly fading away. None of us dared to move. Eventually, the silence returned, but it was a silence filled with dread. Outside, we could hear faint sirens, and soon after, police footsteps rushing through the hall. Only then did the lockdown announcement come to an end, the school staff assuring us it was safe to leave our hiding spots. When the police let us out in single file, they kept us from looking down the hall, where I later heard the intruder had been found. We never learned who that person was or why they came to our school, but the experience left a permanent mark on all of us. The whispers, the scraping sounds, the way that handle shook. It's etched in my mind forever. Story number 2, Storm of Terror, the school lockdown that left us shaken. The storm had started just after noon. Heavy rain beat against the school's windows, and the sound of thunder rolling in made the entire day feel eerie. My friends and I were gathered in the multi-purpose room, stuck inside because the weather had canceled our usual afternoon activities. The dull drone of chatter echoed as we all tried to pass the time, oblivious to the tense scene unfolding just outside the school. Then, without warning, a familiar but unsettling voice came over the PA system. "Attention, staff and students. We are in lockdown. This is not a drill. Secure yourselves and remain silent." As the announcement ended, a hush fell over the room. A few kids exchanged confused glances, while others looked to the teachers for some kind of reassurance. But our teachers' tense expressions told us all we needed to know. This was serious. The multi-purpose room doors were promptly locked, and we were instructed to sit on the floor, away from the windows. I could hear whispers all around me, filled with questions and theories. Some kids were on the verge of tears, clutching their phones, hoping to hear something from their parents. The unease grew, thickening the air as the rain hammered down outside, adding an ominous rhythm to our wait. Minutes dragged by, and then came a low rumble of thunder, followed by faint sounds from outside the room. A commotion in the hallway. We couldn't see anything from where we were, but we could hear the hurried footsteps of police officers and the muffled urgency in their voices. One teacher, Ms. Bell, tried to calm us down, assuring us that everything was under control, but even she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. I'll never forget how her voice quivered, or the way she kept glancing nervously toward the door. As we sat there, I caught a glimpse of a boy named Ethan across the room, his eyes fixed intently on the door, as if bracing himself for something. He'd always been the brave one in our grade, but even he looked rattled, and that made my heart pound harder. The entire room was tense, with a shared sense of dread, every small sound magnified by our collective silence. We later learned that a troubled individual, known to local authorities, had made his way close to the school, threatening harm to himself and anyone nearby, while officers had managed to intervene before he could reach our building. The thought that such danger had come so close left an indelible mark on all of us. After what felt like hours, the all clear was finally announced. But even as we filed out of the room and back into the rain-soaked halls, a quiet unease lingered. We were safe, but we were no longer the same. The storm that day hadn't just been outside. It had struck within those walls, leaving us forever wary and hyper-aware of how quickly normalcy could turn into a nightmare. The experience stayed with us all, a chilling reminder of the unpredictable and fragile nature of safety in our world. Story number 3, Trapped Below, the Basement Lockdown Terror. No one will forget. It was supposed to be a quiet day at Westlake High. As a new intern in the school's IT department, Kyle spent most of his time in the basement office, organizing cables, fixing old computers, and helping teachers with tech issues. The basement was quiet, a world apart from the bustling classrooms and echoing hallways upstairs. But that calm was shattered on a rainy Wednesday afternoon when an announcement boomed over the PA. "Attention, we are in lockdown. This is not a drill." Kyle froze. He could hear the frantic voices of staff on the radio, and panic began to set in. The heavy basement door was already shut, but he moved quickly to lock it and turned off the lights, plunging the room into darkness. He crouched behind a stack of boxes, trying to control his breathing. In the dim light, his phone screen glowed, and he could see notifications flooding in as rumors about an intruder spread through the school. Then footsteps echoed down the stairs. Kyle's heart pounded. Who else would be in the basement? He held his breath, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing him. But then a figure emerged from the shadows. A man in his 20s, dressed in a maintenance uniform. Kyle didn't recognize him. Their eyes met, and Kyle could see the fear reflected in the stranger's face. Without a word, the man gestured for him to stay quiet and crouched beside him, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to burst through the door. The silence between them was thick with tension, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps above them. Kyle's mind raced. Was this man someone who worked at the school, or was he involved in the lockdown? His uncertainty made the situation even more terrifying as he felt trapped in the dark with a stranger whose intentions he couldn't be sure of. And then a loud, deafening bang echoed through the basement, reverberating off the concrete walls. A gunshot. The two of them tensed, their eyes locked in mutual horror. Kyle's thoughts spiraled. Was the intruder close? Were the police nearby? The stranger clenched his fists, glancing toward the door, as if preparing to run, but they both knew there was nowhere to go. The only exit was up those stairs. They waited in silence, listening for any sounds that might tell them what was happening outside their makeshift hiding spot. Time stretched on, every second feeling like a lifetime. Kyle's phone vibrated with a message from his supervisor, telling him to stay hidden until an officer arrived, but the signal was weak, and he wasn't sure if anyone even knew he was in the basement. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound of voices filtered through the silence. Police officers, their footsteps deliberate and calm. The stranger exhaled a shaky breath, and Kyle did too, feeling a small surge of relief. Moments later, officers entered, flashing their lights and checking each corner. When they found Kyle and the stranger, they guided them both upstairs to safety. The details of that day remained a mystery for a long time. Rumors about the intruder and the gunshot spread. But one thing was clear. Kyle's quiet basement office had become a scene of terror, transforming an ordinary day into a haunting experience he would never forget. The lockdown ended, but for Kyle, the fear still lingered, and every echo in the basement seemed to carry the memory of that terrifying day. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.
Story number 1. The Haunting at Hollow Acres, a True Tale of Terror. On a foggy October evening in rural Tennessee, a group of siblings and cousins gathered for a weekend at their grandmother's dilapidated farmhouse. Among them was Emily, a 15-year-old known for her fearless curiosity, and her younger cousin Joey, an adventurous 12-year-old. Hollow Acres had been in the family for generations, but had been abandoned for years. The kids decided to play hide and seek, convinced it would be more thrilling in the eerie, decrepit home nearby. Emily, always one to prove her bravery, chose to hide in an old pantry in the kitchen of the abandoned farmhouse. The musty smell and creaking wood added an unnerving ambiance, but she shrugged it off. As the muffled voices of her cousins faded, she settled into the dark corner and waited. The pantry door shut firmly behind her. She glanced at her watch. 8:13 p.m., time dragged on. Emily heard no footsteps, no laughter, only silence. Her eyelids grew heavy, and before she realized it, she had dozed off. She awoke abruptly to a faint noise. It was a rhythmic tapping sound, slow and deliberate, echoing faintly through the empty house. Checking her watch again, she saw that it was now past 10 p.m. She had been asleep for nearly 2 hours. Her heart began to pound as she realized the game had long ended. She pushed the pantry door slightly open, peering into the pitch-black kitchen. The moonlight streaming through a broken window cast eerie shadows on the walls. "Joey?" she called out softly, but there was no response. The tapping sound grew louder, and it was coming from upstairs. A chill ran down her spine. She debated waiting it out, but decided she needed to leave. Carefully stepping out of the pantry, Emily froze as a new sound joined the tapping. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending the staircase. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something heavy. Emily's breathing quickened and she ducked under the kitchen table, praying whatever it was wouldn't see her. The steps stopped abruptly, just as she thought she heard faint, raspy breathing coming from the doorway. Her instincts screamed at her to run. She bolted out from under the table, heading for the back door. The sudden movement triggered an unearthly shriek, filling the house with a sound so chilling it echoed in her skull. She didn't look back as she burst into the backyard, tripping over roots and loose stones. She collapsed on the grass, gasping for air, as her cousins came running from the main house. "Where were you?" Joey asked, wide-eyed. "We looked everywhere." Emily tried to explain, but her words tumbled out incoherently. She glanced back at the farmhouse. In the upper window, a faint silhouette stood motionless, watching them. No one ventured near Hollow Acres again, but locals whisper that the house has its own stories to tell. Tales of shadows and shrieks that no one dares to explain. The haunting memory still lingers with Emily to this day, a reminder of the terrifying secrets some places keep hidden in plain sight. Story number 2, Vanished in the Shadows, the chilling mystery of the Forgotten Manor. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, a crumbling old manor sat at the edge of the woods, its dark windows staring out like hollow eyes. The manor had long been abandoned, earning it a reputation as a local legend. To most, it was a place of superstition and ghost stories. To a group of thrill-seeking teens, it was the perfect playground for a late-night game of manhunt. That October evening, Megan, Trevor, Carlos, and Lily decided to test their courage. The rules were simple. One person would be it, while the rest hid anywhere inside the manor. Megan volunteered to be the seeker, leaving the others to scatter into the house. Carlos, the boldest of the group, decided to hide in the basement, a place the others avoided because of its dank, oppressive air. Lily tucked herself behind an ancient wardrobe on the second floor, while Trevor slipped into a corner of the dusty attic. Megan began her countdown in the foyer, her flashlight flickering weakly in the stale darkness. Minutes turned into an hour, and Megan had found Trevor and Lily both grinning and exhilarated. Carlos, however, remained missing. His disappearance was unsettling. He was the type to jump out and scare everyone for laughs. "Carlos, come on, game's over!" Megan called out, her voice echoing eerily. As the trio descended into the basement to find him, a sense of unease settled over them. The air was thick and cold, carrying a faint metallic smell. Their flashlights revealed nothing but old crates and cobweb-covered beams. Then, from the corner of the room, they heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. Lily gasped and clutched Trevor's arm as they turned toward the sound. There, sitting on an overturned crate, was Carlos. His face was pale, and his wide eyes stared blankly at the wall. "Carlos, what the hell are you doing down here?" Megan asked, trying to mask her fear with irritation. "I didn't go anywhere," he said flatly, not looking at them. "I've been right here the whole time." His voice was distant, almost mechanical, sending chills through the group. Megan moved closer, shining her flashlight on him. That's when she noticed his shoes were damp and covered in mud, though the basement floor was dry. Trevor's voice wavered as he asked, "How did you get mud on your shoes, Carlos?" Carlos blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. "I don't remember." The group decided to leave immediately, but as they made their way up the creaking stairs, Megan's flashlight caught something in the corner of the basement, a handprint smeared in the dust on the wall. It was larger than any of theirs, and the fingers were unnaturally long. Outside, they questioned Carlos again, but his memory was hazy. He insisted he had been downstairs the entire time, though his unease suggested he wasn't entirely sure. The group swore never to speak of the incident again, but whispers of the forgotten manor spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. To this day, locals claim that shadows move in the windows at night, and those who dare to enter often leave with stories of things they can't explain. The question remains, what really happened to Carlos in the basement, and was he ever truly alone? Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.